Welcome to the October 28, 2015 edition of Horizon. Tonight's program will look at the escalation of violence between the Israelis and the Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank. And I, Mohammed Manzoor, will preside over a debate between our two guests. As you can see from this chart, since the beginning of this month, this new wave of violence has claimed the lives of 56 Palestinians, and on the Israeli side, 8 Israelis lost their lives as a result of the attacks by Palestinians armed with knives and firearms. During the same period, 83 Israelis have been wounded, and it's been estimated that 2,000 Palestinians have become injured. In addition, an Eritrean Jew who was mistaken for a Palestinian attacker was killed, and a settler was run over by a car near Hebron. Human rights groups have called on Israel to refrain from using excessive force, and Palestinian authorities have accused Israel of committing summary executions in public spaces. Visits by Jewish groups to Haram al-Sharif, or the Jewish Temple Mount, and restrictions imposed on Palestinians across this area have rekindled fears among Palestinians that Israel is intent on changing the Islamic charter of the holy site. The ongoing settlement expansion in the West Bank has also been a contributing factor in their anger and frustration. Israel, on the other hand, is accusing the Palestinian Authority and Hamas of inciting violence and disseminating baseless rumors as a way to inflame the anger of the Palestinians.
برای برافروختن خشم فلسطینیان متهم کرده است. در صفحه فیسبوک افق از بازدیدکنندگان
In our Facebook page, we asked visitors whether a two-state solution is still feasible given the continuing expansion of settlements in the West Bank, and you can view the results for yourself.
که نتایج این نظرسنجی را مشاهده می‌کنید.
Our guest today here in our DC studio, Omar Baddar, a Palestinian analyst and a spokesperson for the Palestinian Freedom Project, and from Tel Aviv, Emanuel Navon, a lecturer in international relations at Tel Aviv University.
Gentlemen, welcome to Horizon.
Thank you.
I would like to direct my first question to Omar.
Thank you.
The accusations that Israel is attempting to change or breach the status quo with regards to the Al-Aqsa complex seem to have triggered the recent wave of violence. Do you support these accusations? And if so, how is Israel breaching the status quo?
Well, there certainly has been a series of propagations. We've seen right-wing Israeli settlers make it onto the compound. There's video footage that anybody can look up on YouTube of right-wing Israeli settlers marching in Jerusalem chanting that they would like to see the Al-Aqsa Mosque burn. And then you have members of the Knesset, like Uri Ariel, who said last year that the plan basically is what he would like to envision for the future is the destruction of the Al-Aqsa and to see a Jewish temple built in its place. But whether there is a plan at the end of the day to actually change the status quo or not, I think really misses the point, because at the end of the day, these propagations are just the spark that lit the latest wave of violence, but the real driving force of this violence is an ongoing occupation of the Palestinian territories, land theft, driving Palestinians out of their homes, and this sort of stuff that goes on is basically a recipe that's inevitably going to lead to violence. And I think people who are serious about resolving this conflict peacefully should be looking at that primary cause to resolve the conflict.
Dr. Navon, do you agree with Omar on the causes behind this surge in violence? And are there elements in the ruling right-wing coalition who bear some responsibility in causing this escalation?
Well, no, I do not agree. And the truth of the matter is that what Omar calls the occupation is not the cause of the conflict and of the violence. And the proof is that between 1949 and between 1967, when the West Bank was controlled by Jordan and when the Gaza Strip was controlled by Egypt, nobody at the time established a Palestinian state. Nobody said at the time that they were occupied. And there was violence already at the time against Israelis, many terrorist attacks, and there was no peace at the time. And so the control of the West Bank and in the past of the Gaza Strip by Israel is the consequence and not the cause of the violence. The real cause of the violence, of course, is the same incitement, by the Palestinian leadership, falsely accusing Israel of wanting to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is of course a lie, but this lie is not new.
Frankly,
it started already
really telling
in the 1920s.
That you want to drag us all the way
At the time,
back
there was no occupation, there was no state of Israel. When the leader of the Palestinians, Haj Amin al-Husseini, in 1929, falsely accused the Jews of trying to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Dr. Navon.
It was in 1929. And when he made those false accusations,
I think we have a delay with Dr. Navon.
133 Jews were murdered in Jerusalem, in Hebron, and in Safed.
Dr. Navon, if I could interrupt you for a second, are you then basically rejecting the concept that there is occupation in the West Bank? Are you saying there is no occupation in the West Bank?
I was talking about the claim that this is the cause of the conflict. What I am saying is that the partial control of the West Bank, because don't forget that 98% of the Arab population of the West Bank is ruled by the Palestinian Authority. Do not forget that Israel withdrew completely from the Gaza Strip in 2005. And therefore, this is not the cause of the conflict, it is the consequence of the conflict. If Israel were to withdraw completely to the armistice line of 1949, we would get back to the situation that existed before 1967 when there was no peace. Okay. And so, yes, I am saying that Israel's partial control of the West Bank is the consequence and not the cause of the conflict.
Omar, Prime Minister Netanyahu has repeatedly insisted that the recent violence has nothing to do with the expansion of settlements or the continued occupation of Palestinian territories, as Dr. Navon was basically saying the same kind of argument. Why do you think that Mr. Netanyahu is adamant to reject any correlation between the two?
Yep. I think it's very important to actually start with just a clarification. I mean, it's very convenient that Dr. Navon wants to go back to before the 1960s, before there was an occupation, to mention the fact that there was still a conflict. Indeed, yes, half a century ago, things were very, very different than they are today. But it's very clear at this point that at least since the late 80s, there has been a basic framework for resolving the conflict known as the two-state solution, by which Israel withdraws from the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, and what you get in return is Palestinian recognition of Israel, and that's the two-state solution. Except, of course, throughout the entire peace process, instead of withdrawing from the occupied territories, all Israel did was build more and more illegal settlements on those Palestinian territories, and thereby defeating the entire idea of a peace process. Now, Netanyahu, of course, who wants neither a binational state where Palestinians have equal rights within Israel, nor does he want to end the occupation, will conveniently try to deflect attention away from the issue that is really at hand. But frankly, anybody who is paying attention to what is happening and whose IQ is above average room temperature can see immediately through that propaganda. We're actually talking about an occupation that is condemned by the UN, condemned by every human rights organization, the International Court of Justice, and even the U.S. government, which has been supporting Israel forever with diplomatic support and military aid, also opposes that occupation. So let's not pretend that has nothing to do with things.
Dr. Navon, Mr. Netanyahu has called for direct talks without any preconditions as the only way to resolve the long-standing conflict. These talks have proven futile in the past, and the Palestinians have little or no leverage in any direct negotiations to bargain with Israel. Why should the Palestinian leadership accept this invitation to talks?
Well, I don't understand your question. You're saying basically what you're asking me is why should the Palestinians negotiate at all? We've just heard Omar saying, well, you know, there has been negotiations for the past 22 years, but Israel is not interested in negotiating. And now you're asking me why should the Palestinians be interested in negotiating? Well, the truth is, and the opposite of what has just been said, is that since the signature of the Oslo agreements in 1993, the Palestinians have been systematically breaching those agreements by using weapons and importing illegal weapons, by inciting against Israel, and when twice in July 2000 at the Camp David conference, and then again in 2008 under the leadership of former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, the Israeli leadership offered an almost complete withdrawal from both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as was just described. The Palestinian leadership rejected the peace offer. It was the case of Yasser Arafat in July 2000 and of Mahmoud Abbas in 2008. Why did they reject it? Why did they reject the two-state solution and the land for peace formula? Because they insisted on what they call the right of return, whose meaning is that the descendants of the third generation, the actual or alleged descendants of the refugees, of the Arab refugees of 1948, should be entitled to become citizens of Israel. And therefore, it wouldn't be two-state for two people. It would be a pre-67 Israel with an Arab majority and a Palestinian state with not a single Jew. And this is why those negotiations have failed for the past 20 years, is because whenever there have been serious proposals on the table, the Palestinian leadership ran away, rejected the peace, and started a war of terrorism.
Okay, let me return to Omar. Would you like to respond to that?
Absolutely. I mean, look, this mythical account of what Camp David was, has to be busted immediately. Here's the fact. Camp David II, the person who was Israel's foreign minister at the time, Shlomo Ben Ami, he said that had he been Palestinian, he would not have accepted the Camp David II Accords because he did not think it offered the Palestinians a sovereign state. So that settles that question entirely. And frankly, at the end of the day, you can just look whoever's account you want to take. The fact that settlement building continued throughout the entire peace process and the number of settlers doubled in the West Bank from the beginning of the peace process until it ultimately fell apart is a clear sign that Israel was never serious about ending the occupation. Now, just on the question of refugees, there has been the Arab Peace Initiative, which offered full normalization of relations between Israel and the entire Arab world in exchange for the two-state solution, and that included a just resolution to the question of the refugees. This doesn't mean the return of every single last one of them. It does mean that Israel has to acknowledge that it drove them out because it did. It has to apologize for doing so. There has to be some kind of compensation, and I think everybody who's serious knows that there will be some kind of compromise on the numbers to facilitate a two-state solution coming out of this.
Are we talking about the preconditions that the Palestinian Authority is insisting on? Could you describe what are those preconditions?
The precondition is simple. Israel has to be serious about being willing to give Palestinians the right of self-determination. When you look at this, the Palestinians are the ones who are being asked to compromise on everything. International law is very, very clear about the fact that Israel has to withdraw from all of the territories it occupied in 1967. That happens to include East Jerusalem. All the settlements are illegal. And yet, in practice, the Palestinians are willing to compromise on virtually every one of those things. The borders can be a little bit modified. Jerusalem can be shared to some extent. The settlements, maybe we'll keep some of them. The refugees, maybe we can argue about numbers. But Israel is not willing to make a single compromise for the sake of this, and that's simply because they have the power. You have an arrogance of power where they can keep control of these occupied territories with virtually no consequence, and this is why the conflict continues.
Dr. Navon, why is Israel staunchly against returning to the 1967 borders, and what would it offer in return?
Well, everything that has been just said is completely wrong, of course. According to international law, it's Resolution 242 of the Security Council from 1967 that says that Israel, Resolution 242, that was negotiated for 6 months at the Security Councils, calls for an Israeli withdrawal from territories, not from all the territories, because Israel did not occupy a foreign country, but the West Bank was illegally controlled by Jordan in the past, and Resolution 242 does not call for a return to the pre-67 ceasefire line. So that's first of all. Second of all, regarding the settlements, I did not interrupt you. And you lies. Don't interrupt me with what I say. So when Israel withdrew from the West Bank, all its settlements, did we have peace? Oh no, we didn't. Now, with regard to the West Bank, again, those settlements represent 2% of the territory, and Israel already offered to remove them, as it did, by the way, in the Gaza Strip, which did not bring peace, but on the contrary, it brought dozens of thousands of missiles fired by Hamas towards Israeli cities and civilians. Now, when you talk about the refugees, there were also Jewish refugees who were expelled by the Arab countries and by Iran after Israel independence. 900,000 Jewish refugees. Are you talking about them? Should they also be compensated? Yes, there were refugees on both sides. A just solution means compensation. It doesn't mean granting a right of return, so-called return, to the third generation of refugees. And when Saudi Arabia talks about its peace initiative, what it means by a just solution, it means the right of return. And this is why the Palestinian leadership And the decision to sign a peace agreement with Israel or not does not belong to Saudi Arabia, but to the Palestinian leadership. Whenever they were offered a peace agreement with a complete removal of Israeli settlements, which, as I said, represent only 2% of the territory of the West Bank, they said no because of the right of return, and that's
Dr.
a fact.
Navon, I would like to interrupt you for a second to correct something. As far as I know, and I think it's quite accurate, the Jewish population of Iran were never expelled from Iran. Many decided to basically migrate from Iran after the revolution because of some of the hardship that some of their fellow basically community members experienced, but they were never systematically expelled from Iran. And Iran still has the largest Jewish community outside Israel in the Middle East.
Well, you know, the same historical argument exists for the Arab population of the former British Mandate. Did they leave on their own free will, or were they expelled by Israel? Some of them, many of them, when the Arab leaders at the time said, you have to leave so that we can destroy Israel, or did Israel expel them? Now imagine what would be the fate of Jews in Iran under the regime of the Ayatollahs. I mean, obviously, they had to run for their lives. But the Jews from Iraq, from Syria, from Lebanon, from Libya, and from Egypt were expelled without their property.
No, just a couple of points here that are really important to correct. First of all, when we're talking about he mentioned Gaza, the fact that Israel withdrew from Gaza and there were rockets. Let's also not kid ourselves about the fact that Israel never left Gaza. They withdrew settlers, but they kept a complete and total stranglehold on Gaza, where for a while there, for years, they were not allowing in potato chips or cookies or sodas. I guess what? A fear that Hamas might launch chocolate chip rockets at Israel? I mean, and even after that, after intense pressure from the international community, from humanitarian activists, including lives lost by Turkish activists who were on these flotilla ships trying to get humanitarian aid into Gaza, that Israel eased the siege on Gaza and allowed some humanitarian items in, but it continues to dictate who gets in and who gets out, continues complete and total control of the airspace of Gaza, shoots at Palestinian fishermen who are fishing off of the coast of Gaza. Okay. It is absolutely true. It is absolutely true. And just when you look at that context, you can't pretend that the occupation of Gaza actually ended. And you can't pretend that the Palestinians are free there.
Can I just ask both sides to return to the current crises? Omar, what arrangements could ease the Palestinian concerns regarding the status of the Al-Aqsa complex?
Honestly, there could be gestures of goodwill that could be carried out. But again, you can't have any kind of gesture of goodwill be carried out effectively while Palestinians in East Jerusalem continue to be pushed out of their homes. I mean, virtually every few weeks there's a new footage of Palestinians being thrown out of their homes in East Jerusalem and then settlers who come and take over that home. This is not, there's a systematic ethnic cleansing, so I don't think that ultimately is going to be about any gestures of goodwill. There has to be a real shift in the Israeli government towards actually accepting Palestinian rights.
Let me raise that question with Dr. Navon. Dr. Navon, while calling for the resumption of negotiations, Mr. Netanyahu and his predecessors have continuously changed the realities on the ground by annexing more Palestinian land and expanding huge settlements in the heart of the Palestinian territories in the West Bank. How can Israel speak of peace while it's, in effect, expanding its occupation?
Well, what has been said about Palestinians being expelled from their homes is complete nonsense. Nobody is being expelled from their homes. The only one who've been expelled from their homes were the Jewish inhabitants of the Gaza Strip. And yes, Israel withdrew completely from the Gaza Strip. But when you hear today, for example, that after Israel withdrew, we're still accused of occupying the Gaza Strip. So you might wonder why Israel would have some doubts about what would happen after it completely withdrew from the West Bank. But to answer your question, as I said, those settlements are the result and not the cause of the conflict. And they represent 2% of the territory. And as a matter of fact, in the past 6 years, under the prime ministership of Netanyahu, there has been less settlement construction than under his predecessors. And those are facts. You can check those figures. And therefore, anyways, those constructions are only in the blocks that would stay anyways in the state of Israel in the case of a two-state solution and a partition. Everybody knows that. The Americans know it. The Palestinians know it. But let me ask you a question. If we're really talking about a two-state solution, why can't there be a Jewish minority in a Palestinian state the same way that there's an Arab minority in the Jewish state? 20% of Israel's citizens are Jewish. But when Mahmoud Abbas says that in the future Palestinian state there won't be room for a single Jew, can you explain this to me? Why should there be a minority only in one state?
No. The difference here is absolutely clear and straightforward. The Palestinian population that is within Israel is indigenous. It lived there. It was there before the establishment of Israel. Israel established itself on top of them. But when we're looking at Jewish settlers who are now building within the Palestinian territories, these are people who are stealing Palestinian land in order to live on it. So that's the distinction. When they say there's no tolerance of settlers taking over Palestinian land, this is not some kind of anti-Semitic plan. I mean, this is total nonsense. So many of my friends who are Jewish peace activists travel to Palestine. They say they've never felt welcomed anywhere in the world as they do when they're in Palestinian homes, because they're viewed as people who are there to actually contribute to solving the problem, not the people who are there to steal other people's land and build on it.
Omar, speaking about the two-state solution, I have traveled through the West Bank extensively myself. I was based there as a journalist. And with the large and small fortified Jewish settlements spreading throughout the territory, to me at least, the establishment of a contiguous Palestinian state in the West Bank seems improbable, if not impossible. What other options would the Palestinians pursue if the statehood is no longer feasible?
Look, frankly, there are only two ways to resolve this conflict. You could either give Palestinians independence in the occupied territories and a sovereign state that they can be their own, or the alternative is a single state, one man, one vote for all Israelis and all Palestinians to live together in one state. The problem is, I don't think Israel is interested in either one of them and is building very, very significant impediments to either one of them being realized. So, as you mentioned, there's more than 500,000 settlers now in the West Bank. It's so divided. It's very difficult to imagine that Israel is going to withdraw all these settlers and really allow for Palestinian sovereignty. On the other hand, also the idea that Israel would abolish Zionism and allow Palestinians, refugees, to come back to their homes and allow for a complete mix of people seems equally implausible. So we're really dealing with an Israeli government, and frankly, given the fact that they're democratically elected by a population that is shifting farther and farther to the right, is really concerning. This is a population that is not really interested in resolving the conflict. I think they feel really drunk with power, able to impose whatever they want on the Palestinians without any consequence. And until that changes, until there's a shift in the equilibrium, I think we're going to be stuck.
Dr. Navon, going back to the two-state solution, just yesterday, Martin Schulz, the president of the European Parliament, floated the idea of an Israeli-Palestinian confederation. I know the concept of a one-state solution is very contentious topic in Israel, especially with the sensitivities regarding the long-term demographics of such a state and the Israeli fear that the Arabs would become the majority sooner or later. So what is the strategic objective of the Israeli state if a two-state solution and a one-state solution are off the table? Or are they?
Well, as you know, what is called a two-state solution has been working in theory and failing in practice since it was first proposed in 1937 by the Peel Commission. At the time, of course, it was accepted by the Jews, rejected by the Arabs. Same thing in 1947 when the UN also proposed a partition, accepted by the Jews, rejected by the Arabs. Same thing, despite what Omar said in 2000, and read the testimonies of Dennis Ross, when Israel accepted again the two-state solution at Camp David, rejected by Arafat again in 2008. So as I said, it keeps working in theory and failing in practice because the Palestinians don't want to establish a state, they want to destroy Israel. And when we see today what happens in the Middle East, where 22 failed Arab states and one falling after the other, imploding after the other, look at Iraq, look at Syria, look at Lebanon, look at Libya, the idea of creating another failed Arab state 15 kilometers from Tel Aviv, when the Palestinians keep inciting and are switching more and more towards Islamic fundamentalism. I remind you that Hamas controls the West Bank. I remind you that the reason why Mahmoud Abbas hasn't had election, controls the Gaza Strip, I remind you that the reason why Mahmoud Abbas has postponed elections for 10 years for his leadership is because he knows that Hamas would win. So we have a fundamentalist society that sees itself as Islamic, does not even recognize the very concept of nation state. And they're talking about creating another failed Arab state in the Middle East. It's a bit counterintuitive.
Can I just say that, let's say we accept your argument. So what is the Israeli solution? What is the strategic solution that Israel seeks for this conflict? If they reject the concept of creating another failed Arab state in your terms, or basically you're saying that a Palestinian state would have the same fate as Iraq, Syria, or Libya. So what is your solution? And especially because I know that Israel is very reluctant to accept the concept of a one-state solution.
Right, but first of all, your question assumes that there is a solution. And the truth is that in life, not every problem has a solution. Eventually, we might be able to reach a two-state solution, as we have tried since 1937. But the fact is that until now, and when Mahmoud Abbas says that he will never recognize Israel as a nation-state of the Jewish people, I do not see how we can implement it. Now, Israel always had the option, as it did in the Gaza Strip, to unilateral withdraw from most of the West Bank, as it did in the Gaza Strip. That would preserve its Jewish majority, and it would let the other side continue in its complete rejection of Israel. Of course, even if Israel would withdraw from the West Bank, it would still be accused of occupying it, the same way that it's still accused of occupying the Gaza Strip. But at least it would put the demographic issue on the side. That would not completely solve the problem, but at least Israel has this card under its knee.
Omar, would you like to respond to that?
First, let's be clear also about the fact that when he's invoking what's happening in the region and the shift to Islamization and this and that, what he's really doing is he's engaging in a really effective propaganda technique to shift people's sympathies. When you see what ISIS is doing, to somehow try to connect that to what Israel is fighting in the Palestinian territories, of course, is transparently silly. The Palestinian struggle for justice, the Palestinian struggle for freedom in their own country has nothing to do with the drive towards Islamization in neighboring countries. And certainly Israel's struggle to steal Palestinian lands and to build settlements on it has nothing to do with fighting Islamization. So just let's put that one aside. Now, in terms of what Israel's solution is right now, Israel has chosen the apartheid solution. It does not want to grant Palestinians independence. It does not want to treat them as equal citizens. It effectively wants to squeeze them behind certain walls, give them really tiny areas where they can exercise no sovereignty, where they can be completely under the boot of Israeli control. And that's effectively the apartheid solution. And what that calls on from the international community, not very different from what happened in South Africa during the apartheid era, is international pressure on Israel to actually compel it to end the apartheid system and to accept equality for Palestinians and treat them as human beings. This includes sanctions. This includes putting economic pressure, political pressure. And I think we're moving in that direction, actually. Globally, there is less and less tolerance for Israeli policies.
Let's go back to the recent wave of violence. There are those who describe the recent violence as a third intifada. While, as you know, the first intifada was considered the precursor to the Oslo Accord, the second intifada is considered by the majority of Palestinian analysts as a major defeat. Why would a third intifada be any different?
What is really, again, when you say intifada, it's a generic term for rebellion. Rebellion, the form that a rebellion takes, really matters. The first intifada was largely nonviolent. You saw a policy of Palestinians who are throwing rocks, being beaten by Israeli soldiers, having their bones broken. As a matter of policy, soldiers were testifying that these were the orders that they were given. The second intifada, Palestinians decided to do an armed version of this, which I think gave Israel an excuse to crack down in the worst way possible. With some sense of justification from a PR perspective, when Palestinians are shooting using guns and blowing themselves up and so on, it gives Israel an excuse to crack down while generating international sympathy that maybe they're fighting something that is somewhat legitimate. I think what is really needed is a Palestinian nonviolent struggle. The one that I was just talking about, in the West Bank, in opposition to the wall, in opposition to the occupation, boycotting of settlement products, and what is needed also internationally in solidarity with that nonviolent uprising is also nonviolent pressure to compel Israel to back down. I think that form of uprising would probably be the most effective way to combat Israeli occupation and apartheid.
Dr. Navon, keeping on the same topic, Israel's security and that of the Jewish people were central to Mr. Netanyahu's election campaign and his political platform ever since he's been in power. Yet, we are now faced with bloodshed on Israeli streets, the West's rapprochement with Iran, and maybe more fundamentally, a damaged strategic ties with the United States. Very senior former officials such as Shabtai Shavit, the former Mossad chief, have pointed the finger of blame at the Prime Minister's policy. What is your take, and who do you think should bear the blame for this?
Well, look, first of all, I have to make a few corrections with what has just been said. The current violence has nothing to do with a peaceful demonstration against Israel. It is the stabbing and the intentional killing of Jews with a Palestinian leadership that encourages it, with parents that glorify the killing of Jews as a religious commandment, again, as a reaction of the so-called destruction of Al-Aqsa, which is a complete lie. Now, with regard to what happens after that, and on who to put the blame, because this is your question, again, there have been, under the previous administration of Netanyahu, efforts by the U.S. government to reach an agreement, to negotiate between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. In the beginning, Mahmoud Abbas completely refused to even talk to the Israeli government. Then he demanded a freeze in settlement construction, which he obtained for 9 months. There was a freeze which never happened in the previous negotiations. And then, after the freeze was over, he finally accepted to negotiate, but asked for the freeze to be reconducted. And then he demanded the release of terrorists and described them as heroes. So there were negotiations under the previous governments. Again, and Dennis Rose talks about it, many officials in the American government, Mahmoud Abbas refused again and again to give up on the so-called right of return. He refused to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, which means, in effect, canceling the so-called right of return. And so at the end of the day, yes, we do have to negotiate to find a two-state solution. But as long as the Palestinian leadership runs away from its historical responsibilities, continues to incite its population, promising to come back to Jaffa, to Haifa, and to Beersheba, and to say that Israel will be, at the end of the day, destroyed, and it's just a staged strategy, I do not see how we can reach a two-state solution. As I said, Israel, of course, always has the option of doing that unilaterally, as it did in the Gaza Strip, and let the other side build its own failed state.
Omar, would you like to respond to that?
When we're talking about incitement, I mean, again, this is just a cheap shot, because there are people who, like Rabbi Yitzhak Shapiro, one of the leaders in the settlements, who also says, based on biblical understanding, that killing Palestinian civilians, including children, is okay. And everybody can do that. You can grab random religious leaders, lunatics who have said really crazy stuff. But that's not the point. You're really avoiding the central issue.
That is not true.
It is absolutely true. You can check those quotes for yourself. The central issue here is that when we're looking at the occupation, I mean, it's quite remarkable that you have one side that is building more and more settlements on land that they're pretending that they want to give up, and then nobody's asking any questions. But we're supposed to pretend that Israel is serious about a peace process that it itself undermined by building more and more settlements and entrenching the occupation deeper and deeper. That's just utter silliness.
While Israeli society and government have been swimming further to the right of the political spectrum, there has been barely any rotation of political elites on the Palestinian side. President Abbas has been in power since the passing of Chairman Arafat, and Fatah and Hamas are still pretty much run by the same old gang. Mm-hmm. Is there no appetite for change among the Palestinians, or is there no means of bringing about that change within the Palestinians?
No, I think there is a situation of some level of despair within Palestinian society. Certainly there's no legitimacy for the current leadership that exists there. But frankly, under occupation, it really does not matter that much what leadership happens to be in charge. You have problems of religious extremism, problems of corruption, and this and that. But at the end of the day, without a prospect for Palestinian freedom and independence, whoever happens to be in charge of the Palestinians is really just the guard who's supposed to keep Palestinians under control and basically taking the burden of the occupied people off of the occupier. I mean, that's all we're talking about when it comes to that leadership. And, it's not a pretty situation, but it's very difficult to imagine how it can improve in the short term without, again, some major international involvement to shift the equilibrium and to give Palestinians some sense of hope that there is a prospect for freedom. And then I think fighting for better leadership is something that could come out of it.
Dr. Navon, on that point, I think you would agree that there are very few Palestinian leaders who would be more inclined towards reaching a political solution with Israel than President Mahmoud Abbas. I mean, if Abbas steps aside, obviously, I mean, the expectation is that, or the likelihood is that his shoes will be filled with more people who are more radical So why doesn't Israel take opportunity of the current Palestinian leadership, which is inclined towards peace, to reach some sort of conclusion?
How do you know it is inclined? It is the same Mahmoud Abbas who, when he was offered in 2008 by Ehud Olmert, Israel's prime minister at the time, a complete, I insist, complete with land swaps, Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and from the West Bank, including in Jerusalem, including sharing sovereignty over the Temple Mount, including accepting some Palestinian refugees, Mahmoud Abbas, who you say is moderate and who you say is more likely to make peace with Israel, said no. Condoleezza Rice said herself she couldn't believe the Israeli proposal, and Mahmoud Abbas said no. So I really don't know what you're talking about. Now, with regard to Mahmoud Abbas's leadership, the Palestinians have gotten so used to blaming everything on the occupation.
Who would you say is more,
well, as I said,
a better option?
When you look at the Palestinian leadership today, I don't know that there is a better option. I just know that Mahmoud Abbas refused a very generous offer by Israel. Even President Obama said it. Condoleezza Rice said it. It was a very serious and generous offer. He rejected it. And of course, always saying, well, you know, we don't have a moderate or we don't have a democratic leadership because of the occupation, Is it also because of the Israeli occupation that no Arab state is democratic, maybe with the exception of Tunisia? I mean, look at the Gaza Strip. After Israel completely withdrew from the Gaza Strip, Hamas took over. And that has nothing to do with Palestinian freedom of self-determination. It has nothing to do with it. The Palestinians are not free because their leadership is not a leadership that respects human rights and doesn't respect freedom. Look at Hamas, and if tomorrow Mahmoud Abbas would have election in the West Bank, everybody knows, and he knows, that Hamas would take over. Okay. Would this bring freedom to the Palestinians? Of course not.
Before I give the response to Omar, I would like to say something about the Gaza Strip because I was based there for a number of times. And as you know, Gaza is partially under the control of Hamas, and there are even much more radical kind of jihadi groups down towards Egypt to control some of the territory there, and they have these infightings between themselves and Hamas. Now, you say that what happened in the Gaza Strip with the partial withdrawal of Israel has led to Hamas. Let's say that Hamas is basically set aside from power tomorrow. It just basically collapses on itself. Who do you think will fill the vacuum in Gaza? Wouldn't it be the jihadis, the ones which are much more closer to the jihadis in Syria or in Iraq?
Well, it is already the case. You already have a jihadi presence in the Gaza Strip. And I found it amazing that you called it the partial withdrawal of Israel, because Israel completely withdrew from the Gaza Strip. The fact that there is a sea military blockade, which is also imposed by Egypt. Are you accusing Egypt of still occupying the Gaza Strip because it also imposed this military blockade on the Gaza Strip?
Certainly,
I mean, Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip between 1949 and 1967. You still accuse Egypt of occupying the Gaza Strip?
I would let Omar answer that if you would like to respond to that.
But no, Egypt is controlling the border with Gaza. It's blocking the control with Gaza. And do you accuse Egypt of occupying Gaza?
I'm explaining to you the difference. The difference is Israel doesn't just block its border with Gaza. Israel controls Gaza, does not allow Gazan fishermen to go into the water. That's not just controlling its border with Gaza, as opposed to Egypt. Again, I don't want to make any excuses for the Egyptians. Certainly, they're not behaving well in this situation, but they're merely controlling their border.
And they fish all the time.
Just look at how often they get shot at whenever they go beyond a certain range because of the blockade that is imposed on Gaza. But when we're looking, if Emanuel and other people in Israel are tired of hearing about the occupation, there's a very easy solution. They can just end it, and then they don't have to hear about it anymore. But instead, they would rather just maintain it and then keep using it as an excuse to deflect the conversation onto other stuff. Now, I want to answer the point about the rise of extremists in Gaza. The success of Hamas came as a direct result of the fact that the Palestinian Authority was bending over backwards to try to reach a peaceful settlement with Israel through negotiations and failed because Israel was not ending the occupation. That's why people shifted their support to more violent elements within Palestinian society. And you can see it in opinion polls early on during the peace process. There was very widespread opposition to suicide bombings because people are saying, hey, look, we're working towards a peaceful solution. Stop doing this. You're making things worse. And only when it became clear that Israel was not really interested in ending the occupation, after it continued building settlements and sparked the Second Intifada, did we see this rise of support to people who are using violence as a means of fighting Israel. Now, just one last point, when we're talking, let's not forget
Complete nonsense.
Let's not forget about, frankly, the violent radicalism of the Israeli government. Let's not pretend that they're electing people who are interested in peace. It's a right-wing coalition government that wants to trample on Palestinians militarily. They're accused by every human rights organization of indiscriminate bombing of Palestinian civilians. So that's not a government that is in any position to point the finger at other people being violent.
I would like to ask Dr. Navon about that specific point. Dr. Navon, I think you would agree that there is little hope for Mr. Netanyahu's right-wing coalition to make any meaningful overtures, let alone concessions to the Palestinian side, without putting the coalition itself in imminent danger of collapse. Would this wave of violence strengthen the hand of the hardliners in the Israeli establishment, or could it perhaps generate a need for political change?
The opposite is true, and the opposite also of what has just been said, because it is precisely under the leadership of the late Yitzhak Rabin with the Oslo process, after the Oslo agreement was signed with Arafat, that the suicide bombing, when there was at the time a political horizon, right? It was at the height of the peace process that the suicide bombing started.
Indeed,
when
there was
Arafat
opposition to them.
played games with Hamas. It was at the height of the peace process with all these buses where it was in 95 and 96 before he was murdered, at the height of the peace process, that suicide bombing started. And these are facts. So it is precisely when we had the peace process, when Arafat came from Tunis and brought his minions, his terrorists, with weapons, that the terrorism started, more terrorist attacks than we had ever before. Now, when it comes to Israel, why do you think, have you ever asked yourself, why in the past the left and the Labour Party would win elections all the time? And since Arafat came in, the right has been winning the elections because Arafat and then Mahmoud Abbas has pushed Israeli society to the right by convincing more and more Israelis that they have been deceived by a Palestinian leadership that has been lying to it all the time, playing a double game with this peace process. So if the Palestinian leadership, which is responsible mostly for the switch of Israeli society to the right, wants to stop this, it should maybe one day be serious about peace. Stop lying. Say yes to a peace proposal. And again, if the Israeli society, as you said, the right has been winning more and more elections to the right, the main reason is the PLO and its decisions.
Dr. Navon, I would like to put this question to you because there are many analysts who are saying that the shift to the right in the Israeli political system has more to do with the change in the demography of the Israeli society. I mean, the expansion of the Haredi, the introduction of the Israelis who have migrated from Russia, and they're generally viewed as being more right-wing than perhaps the Ashkenazi who immigrated from Western Europe or Eastern Europe. And these changes have contributed to the right-wing majority in Israel. Don't you think that these demographic basically developments have had some impact on what we're seeing now?
Well, you were talking about the Jews who immigrated from Russia, and the fact is that the main wave of immigration came in the early 90s, before the elections of 1992. And what caused the left, the Labour Party, to win the elections in Israel in 1992 was thanks to the vote of the Russian immigrants. They're the one who helped the Labour Party win the elections in 1992. With regard to the Jews who moved to Israel, many of them, as I said before, who were expelled by Arab countries, moved to Israel in the 50s and 60s, they were always perceived as being more conservative, as being less trustful of the Arabs, and yet the left, the Labour Party, was in power all the time. It is only in 1977 that for the first time the right won an election. Then there was a transition, and then the left won an election again in 1992, which brought the Oslo agreements. And after the whole process collapsed, especially after Arafat rejected the peace offer at Camp David, the left in Israel has been unable to convince the public, not because of changes in Israeli society, but because it's really hard today to convince Israeli voters to trust the Palestinian leadership after what we have experienced in the past 2 decades.
This reversal of the narrative is almost comical. I mean, look, let's just correct a couple of things. When he mentioned the fact that it was after the peace process began that there were suicide bombings, absolutely, that is true. But it was also a right-wing Israeli who actually killed Rabin. And it was also a right-wing Israeli settler, Baruch Goldstein, who went into a mosque in 1994 and opened fire on a bunch of people praying and killed 30 of them. And this is a person who's being celebrated by settlers on a regular basis whenever that anniversary comes up. And you're looking at an Israeli society today where people are stabbing each other. Israeli Jews are stabbing each other because they're mistaking each other for Arabs. This is the environment that we're actually living in right now. So to suggest, and again, when you go back to the peace process, it is so simple. It is so obvious why it failed that you don't actually have to be familiar with the details of what the peace agreement was. There is complete and total increase in settlement control. There is an increase in Palestinians being driven out of their homes in the West Bank. If you look at human rights reports by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, there's complete impunity for settler violence against Palestinians in those areas. So really what led towards the failure of the peace process is not something that anybody can dispute on these silly talking points. It's very, very clear that there was an expansion of occupation when the point was a retraction of occupation in order for a Palestinian state to exist.
I dispute it, and it's not silly, though that's the facts.
Dr. Navon, I would like to allocate the last few minutes of the program to the role that the international community can play in diffusing these tensions. What role do you envision for any other partner apart from the United States? There have been suggestions that there could be an international observatory a team for the Al-Aqsa complex, or the Europeans could play a greater role. What would Israel accept? What would be acceptable for the Israeli state and nation?
Well, as you know, regarding the Temple Mount, which you call the Al-Aqsa complex, Israel has already agreed to a 24/7 cameras to prove that there's no change in the status quo. I mean, this is a lie. There's no change in the status quo. And Israel is happy to prove it by having those cameras. So Israel has also already accepted it. I think it's a good idea, which John Kerry proposed. But what we have to have also is, people always say Israel gets a free pass, but the Palestinians get a free pass all the time for saying no to peace all the time. There has to be pressure also on the Palestinians, and put pressure on them to say to Mahmoud Abbas to stop lying about the status quo, to stop inciting. He's the leader, his own population. I mean, look at the Facebook page of the Fatah movement. It is full of incitement to murder Jews. There has to be international pressure on the Palestinian leadership to explain why it has systematically rejected all the peace offers, why it is lying about a status quo on the Temple Mount, and why it is inciting its population to murder Jews. When this happens, maybe we will be able to move forward with the peace process.
Omar, what role do you think that the international community can play in diffusing this round of violence and perhaps the greater conflict?
I think the international community, in terms of rhetoric, is already where it needs to be. I mean, the United Nations keeps passing resolutions against the occupation, keeps condemning Israeli violations of Palestinian rights. What you really need right now is enforcement. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where the only country that actually has leverage over Israel is the United States. But the United States, because of our domestic political constraints here, gives unmitigated diplomatic support to Israel through using nearly 50 vetoes at the United Nations to protect Israel from enforcement, gives Israel unconditional military aid, even at points when there's friction between Obama and Netanyahu about clashing over everything. Yet U.S. strategic support for Israel actually continues. And I think that's what really needs to be challenged. And it's something that the rest of the international community can try to contribute towards by isolating Israel more and more and make it a pariah state that it is until it agrees to abide by international law like any other state. And finally, on the question of incitement for Mahmoud Abbas, I mean, there's a lot of things that you can say about Abbas, but an inspiring speaker is certainly not one of them. Not somebody who can move anybody to do anything, frankly. I don't think that he enjoys widespread support. And Palestinians who watch their homes being demolished, who watch their friends who are protesting being shot, that can drive people to violence a lot more than some leaders saying some stuff about what might or might not be happening at Al-Aqsa.
Dr. Navon, we only have about 1 minute left, and I would like to give the final word to you. Would you like to add anything?
Well, we've heard a lot about the same propaganda over and over again. It's always Israel's fault. Israel violates international law. Of course, that is not the case. What I would like to say is that we as Israelis, of course, have an interest to put an end to this conflict. Both sides have their own claims, and you cannot completely reconcile those claims. But this whole idea of always having an obsession with Israel, if you really want Israelis who want to have peace, who want to reach an agreement as they've proved it in the past, instead of having this obsession of boycotts and always accusing Israel and the Jews and accusing them of things that they don't actually do, I think it's more important to have a dialogue, to have a culture of dialogue. And I think eventually we might be able to have a real dialogue and negotiations if instead of this propaganda and those lies, people would set the record straight. And I think that confidence can be rebuilt, should be rebuilt. There has been too much violence, too much stabbing. It is time to stop this violence and to think about a peace process again.
Based on what you just said, I just want to raise one more question. Over the past year, we have seen huge diplomatic successes by the Palestinian Authority in the international community. We had the raising of the Palestinian flag in the United Nations. We had the acceptance of Palestine as a state in some of the organizations related to the United Nations. Would you agree that these developments may somehow stem from the international community's concern with the continuous, basically, stalemate in the peace process?
Well, the very concept of international community is, of course, an oxymoron. There's no international community. There are different countries with different interests. At the UN, of course, the Palestinians enjoy this automatic majority of Arab states and Muslim states at the General Assembly. Whatever they say gets a majority. So as Abba Ibn said at the time, even if they would pass a resolution saying that the world is flat, they would have a majority at the General Assembly. So the General Assembly really always supports the Palestinians anyways. But what we have to do is to make peace on the ground. And on the ground, unfortunately, we have a rejectionist leadership.
We only have 5 seconds left.
And we need international community, at least countries that have the power to influence both sides, to influence both sides and not only one side.
Thank you, Dr. Navon and Omar Baddar. Thank you both for taking part in our program. و ممنون از شما که همراه ما بودید. تا افق دیگر بدرود. Thank you.